Sentient swords are everywhere in fantasy media. In fact, regular swords are everywhere too, disproportionately so. Yes, there were some historic periods and environments where the sword is a primary weapon. The gladius in Roman shield walls, samurai, the fencing craze of the Renaissance, or the use of the Zweihander among Doppelsöldner. But by and large, the sword is a historic sidearm. Even many mounted knights didn't use a sword until partway through the battle, and bows and polearms should really be considered the primary, most common weapons on a historic battlefield. But the fact remains, fantasy lovers love a good sword. And they really love a bad sword. Today I want to talk about three things. 1. Where does this trope come from? 2. Why are swords the most common form or type of sentient weapon? And 3. How can we use speculative world building and myth and legend to make this concept even cooler? So it is true that the first sentient weapons in our storytelling come from myths and legends, especially epic poetry, and most are wielded by some great hero, or in some cases pass through multiple hands during the course of the epic. Generally, they fall into two categories: objects gained from the divine, or cursed objects, most likely with some demonic influence. These mythic weapons of our stories past aren't all swords either. Sharur from Sumerian mythology is in the former camp, a weapon/emissary from the gods themselves. It takes the form of a mace, known as the Smasher of Thousands. Sun Wukong's weapon in Journey to the West, Ryuji Jin Gobong, is essentially a large iron stick with myriad powers. Unlike Sharur, it does not speak, but does certainly respond to our hero's wishes, wants, words, and desires. Earlier iterations of the legendary weapon in the story could also transform into a form of nature spirit, which held its own weapon, which is like weaponception, very fun. Nonetheless, the only other non-sword-based sentient weapon I could really find is a magical spear, which comes to be owned by a Hawaiian chieftain, Kauilani. The story of this weapon is great, as it advises its warrior on exactly how to fight back against an incredibly intelligent sea monster, while also coordinating multiple wooden warriors that it has helped animate with its own magic. I suppose we should probably determine what I actually class as a sentient weapon. My basic conclusion is that the weapon does not need to talk, but must be shown to respond to communication, and show some degree of independent thought or independent activity. The Norse sword, Tyrfing, for example, barely qualifies. It's a weapon that is cursed, so that it cannot be sheathed without causing death. It is cursed to commit 3 evils and to kill its bearer. This plays out largely through doom, fate, and irony, not necessarily the sword's own personal actions. Nevertheless, as Tyrfing could be interpreted as forcing its bearer to kill, most notably Heidrek killing his brother, we shall include it here. So, as we've seen so far, sentient weapons are present in epic tales throughout the world, on both sides of the morality spectrum. They're not all swords in our ancient myths, but it is true that swords are generally more prevalent. From the Hindu mythic sword of Asi, a dreadful primordial turned platonic ideal of sword, the strongest sword in existence, through the magic sword of Kullervo, a Finnish tale which sees the sword in question given by a god to the titular fellow, who then uses it to slaughter his entire village, and then offers his life to the sword, at which point the sword, in the most blasé tone possible, says that it doesn't care whose blood it drinks. Even Orna, the sword of famed Fomorian king Tethra in Irish mythology, seems to be sentient, as it insists upon bragging about every evil deed it's done, even when King Tethra no longer holds it. The sword of Calavida is a particularly interesting example. It is cursed by its maker, as Calavida kills the maker's son with the very sword that he just bought from him. Later, the sword is stolen by a mage and, in pursuit, gets dropped in a stream. Calavida asks the sword to accompany him again, but the blade refuses, saying it prefers to lie in the stream with the water nymphs. As such, Calavida gives it one last order before leaving. To spite the thief, it should attempt to cut the feet of anyone who wades through this river. At the end of the epic, having forgotten all of this, Calavida returns and gets his feet chopped off by the malevolent talking sword and dies. There are certainly more legendary talking or sentient swords than any other type of weapon, as far as I can tell, in our broadest mythic categories. But this is just in epics and legends. How does all of this translate to fantasy? This is where we return to the original tangent that I started this video with. Swords are historically, generally, a backup weapon, a sidearm for when all your plans have gone to pot. But it is also true that the romantic, in this case like the art movement, ideal of a medieval warrior was a knight in shining armor, gleaming blade at the ready. We could debate about the medievalism of the fantasy genre all day long, but it is hard to argue that the genre doesn't grow specifically out of importing romantic aesthetics onto old epic storytelling. A clash between two opposed swordsmen is just more intimate, visceral, and romantic than a barrage of arrows across a field. Swords become the knight's weapon in reimaginings of the historical knight, and eventually become the de facto fantasy weapon, harking back to a mythic past that never was. Solidified certainly by the 50s, when sword and sorcery comes into its own as a subgenre. It is in this environment that the synthesis of fantasy's sword obsession and the epic poems make their clearest mark. At the start of the 60s, Poul Anderson publishes The Broken Sword, a reimagining of Old Norse tales, including Tyrfing as a central feature. And just a few years later, Michael Moorcock publishes The Dreaming City, containing the sword Stormbringer. Stormbringer is a synthesis of all the swords we've loved before. Like the Sword of Calavida, it has will outside its wielder and can move on its own. Like Orna and Shurur, it can talk to those who hold it. Like Asi, it contains the soul of a powerful entity, and like Asi, has the power to kill or maim even the gods. And like Tyrfing and the Sword of Kullervo, it has a bloodthirsty streak, seeking to cause death and destruction, specifically enjoying drinking blood like Kullervo's blade. This is not to say Stormbringer isn't original or just cool, just that it owes an awful lot to these old epic weapons. But the thing is, so many fantasy swords since Stormbringer are just Stormbringer again. From explicit copies like D&D's Bloodrazor to less direct references like Sanderson's Nightblood and Critical Role's Craven Edge. The idea of a black, life-drinking sword is simply cool. But one thing being cool does not necessarily create a ubiquitous trope that infects an entire genre for the next 60 years. It needs to have cultural cachet on top. And there is the missing piece of this story of swords. Romantic notions of skilled single combat and the Black Knight, legendary weapons from our oldest epics, and the final ingredient, metal. Metal music and fantasy have a strange symbiosis, largely linked by shared aesthetic sensibilities. I mean, Conan is kind of a perfect example. Huge man with huge sword or axe facing off against the rest of the world is about as metal as it gets. Stormbringer lives a life of its own within metal music, having multiple songs about it and referencing it, arguably achieving significantly more cultural cachet than could be garnered through fantasy readership alone. The metal community is the perfect breeding ground for unironic enjoyment of exactly the kind of cool engendered by a sentient sword. And it's in exactly this landscape where D&D really starts making some waves. Of course, Tolkien, wargaming and medieval simulationism play their parts in D&D, but this is a romantic vision of the medieval, filled to the brim with swords. Romantic and metal aesthetic sensibilities are shockingly close when observed together, and a romantic vision filled with swords has a lot of similarities to what metal tries to do aesthetically. And so many of these swords in especially D&D, but fantasy more broadly in a post-D&D space, are sentient. It is certainly D&D that solidifies this trend. Almost half of the presented sentient weapons in the Forgotten Realms are swords, as just one example. I know a lot of what I'm saying here can be boiled down reductively to sentient swords are cool, but this truly was the perfect storm of a romantic, metalified anachronism mixed with ancient legends from around the world that makes this talking sword trope quite so ubiquitous in our modern fantasy landscape. So what can we do with this? How can we refresh this now classic feature of modern fantasy? Firstly, it's obvious, use items that aren't swords. It seems simple, but it's surprisingly tough to put away our prior assumptions. Of course, we can simply move on to other weapons, but why not instead seek out sentient magical items that aren't weapons at all? This also isn't a novel suggestion. There are plenty of rings, caps, and gems which hold sentience within them. But outside science fiction, there are precious few suits of sentient armor, for example. Weirdly, shields, yes, but armor, not so much. More radically, we can actually try and do more with this trope. At the moment, it feels incredibly binary. Either your sentient weapon is inhabited by something ancient and demonic, cursed or evil, likely demanding blood as payment or sacrifice, or it is a tool of the divine, giving advice and aid to help a hero through their journey. Even the Elder Scrolls, usually a paragon of interesting and well-considered world-building, falls back on the former trope with their Akaviri sentient blood drinker swords. D&D's, or the Forgotten Realms' Moonblades, are actually quite innovative in this particular regard. They avoid the evil cursed magic and the divinely created magic by using ancestry as the locus of power. Each elfin bloodline has an ancestral moonblade, wielded through history by various champions. The blades take on powers from their old wielders and judge whether a new claimant is worthy based in part on the prior champions it has known. They are thus largely neutral entities with the powers to judge and to learn. It is certainly worth going in this direction of losing the binary and exploring more options than gods and demons. But we can also go further. what grants our sentient weapons their sentience? Again, curses and demons seem very common answers, but why not tie this in our world building to more specific concepts? If the world has an unusual concept of the soul, operates on karmic reincarnation, or holds true to an animism that even goes so far as man-made objects with being imbued with spirit, all of these could be wonderful explanations, certainly more original than devils, curses, or trapped wizards after a bad experiment. Equally, in worlds where the mind is a category of power, residues or echoes of people's thoughts may rarely be imprinted onto objects. All of these allow the sentient weapon to be a little less omnipresent in the story we're trying to tell. If your sword is an ancient demon or messenger for the divine, its words hold incredible weight, as it is expected to be an expert in some things, and expected to be an authority, or at least be, in the devil's case, ignored at all costs. But if your sentient weapon is not some grand, high, arrogant wizard, ancient evil demon, but a nature spirit, perhaps one in constant pain by being forced to be in the shape of a weapon, or just a guy whose ghostly mental imprint resonated and echoed within the steel, then not only can we foster more interesting interpersonal dynamics, but we also allow the wielder a bit more agency, and the duo in general more chances to be clueless or in the dark. This is not to say that a hapless hero and hyper-experienced sentient weapon is a dull storytelling device, as our Hawaiian spear story proved earlier. But we can also see great new avenues opening up by interrogating what weapons are. They're tools designed for hurting things, made with a purpose in mind. As tools, materials and maintenance are of utmost importance. Does sharpening a blade also hone the mind of the weapon? Does it hurt? Is a shattered blade a fragmented mind? What if a weapon needs to be reforged, or a warhammer requires an entire new shaft? Where does the weapon's soul, if it has one, reside? These questions are not commonly asked, as the concept itself is relatively on the far-fetched side, but if such weapons are as common as they seem to be in D&D styled fantasy, these are questions certainly worth thinking about. Secondly, speaking of important concerns, it is likely that in a magical world, and in fact in our own history, that weapons aren't just made of inert, inorganic materials. Bows carved from dryad host trees, axes from dragon's jawbones, a spiked mace formed of the egg of a sea leviathan. Sentience seems a reasonable magical effect for all three to have. That last one sounds so cool, I might actually have to steal that from myself. Maybe as a flail instead. But speaking of bows and flails, weapons often have multiple distinct parts. Perhaps due to its material construction, a weapon is only sentient in one specific material part. Nunchucks, which complain when you use the non-sentient end, and a sentient arrow perhaps instead of a sentient bow. Especially if focused aura can imbue objects with sentience, you'd find more things like this in a world. But I think the biggest thing we can learn from the presentation of sentient weapons in our oldest myths, epics and legends is that it's most interesting when they are somewhat at odds with our hero's goals. I don't mean here that a goody two-shoes knight should be paired up with Tyrfing, I mean it's been done, but that the relationship more generally between warrior and sentient weapon should be one of contrast. Yes, it is true that this is most simply seen in the murderous, bloodthirsty weapon who will eventually murder and drink the blood of the hero's true love. But the best stories which use this trope place the contrast in competency, attitude, and opinion instead. This is a duo. Holmes and Watson, Batman and Robin, or Lee and Carter from Rush Hour. Each has skills the other lacks, and they're in it together, even if there's a lot of disagreeing to do along the way. The greatest of our mythic examples exemplify this. A spear that has to magically summon helpers so that its wielder even has a chance at successfully following the spear's own strategy. A sword that prefers water nymphs to its wielder, and when the wielder gets angry and barks an order at it, follows that order in the most spitefully, maliciously compliant way possible. These are the dynamics we're missing. I suppose what I'm really saying is that the sentient weapon is one of the earliest and best iterations of a good buddy cop or road trip story. We should treat this trope as such. Dynamic, disagreeing duos with a common goal, or at least, being forced to work together for the greater good, or greater bad if that's your thing. This is, I think, the best way to go when dealing with the sentient weapon as a trope. I hope you've enjoyed this dive into sentient weapons. If there's any topics you'd like me to cover in the future, please do let me know. And then do all of the lovely YouTube things that you know by now and, help out the channel. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.